All right, hey Andrew. I appreciate you taking the time to send these swings. Um, so how this is going to work is this first part is going to be just a traditional analysis, so that you can kind of see what I'm looking at. We can look at this together. Then the second part, I'm going to hop on camera and do sort of a summary of the first part, and then give you some drills, give you some things to feel, so we can start to build this. So let's just jump right in. The first thing I'll look at is you look like you're in a really good position in your feet and your legs. You notice here, all the basic checkpoints, the feet slightly turned out. The legs are in a strong position here. Knees kind of pushed out over the feet because we want the legs to be the foundation of this structure. So, the legs being stable really supports the pelvis and your center of gravity. So, um, great job with the setup. Now, one thing I'll tweak here, if you notice, this guy on the right, his name is Mac O'Grady. He's basically, everyone in golf instruction has copied him to some degree. So he's Yoda in my opinion. But the first thing I want you to notice here is, so we'll use him as the model, is what I'm getting at. But the first thing I want you to notice here is, notice his right thumb is slightly on the left side of the shaft, where yours is more down the middle of the shaft. And I think that might contribute to, having some trouble squaring the face up at impact. I'd like to see that right thumb more on the left side of the shaft, more on the other side of the shaft. And then notice here that Mac's got this right index finger loaded. So we call that a trigger finger. I'll talk more about that in the second part, but just how this right hand gets set on the club is really important for leverage and for squaring the face up at impact. So I'll talk more about that in part two, but like to get that thumb just a little more on top, and then I'd like to see, I'll talk about this trigger finger because I know how important it is. Now, the next thing I would point out is, notice here your hands are pretty low. They're pretty pushed down. I know we talk about in those programs, pushing the hands down, but pushing the hands down through impact, not necessarily at setup. So one thing I would tweak here is, notice how from Mac's left shoulder through his left arm, essentially down the shaft, is pretty much in alignment, because this left arm is sort of the bracing effect at impact. It's the stability. So he's got that left arm set up in a little bit stronger position. Strong meaning like leverage strong. Where yours, kind of isn't in a straight line. It kind of comes down here and then it kind of kicks back over here slightly. So I think if we could lift the hands a little bit and move the hands a little more forward, we'd be right where Mac is. And that might require softening this right arm a little bit. And I'll show you how to do this all in part two. Because setup's really important. So many swing flaws are not really swing flaws, they're setup flaws. So that's about all I have for setup. The legs and body look good. I would just tweak the grip a tiny bit and then tweak that left arm a little bit too. Okay, so now the first thing I want to talk about is, as you take the club back, and I know you're in some rough here, but as you take it back, notice the club is sitting pretty firmly pressed into the ground there. And when the club's sitting really firmly on the ground, it makes it have to get kind of picked up. Notice how the club got picked up right there out of the rough, because the level of the height of the club changed right there. It went up. to get it out of the rough. So if you have it pressed down really hard, then when you take the club away, you have to kind of lift up. And you can see this here by um, the height of your head here in the first part. See how much it lifts as you pick the club up. So I want you to notice here, Mac, his club is lightly touching the grass. And then as he takes this away, it can kind of go more straight back. But notice his head, the height of his head in this first little takeaway part. Stays pretty level. So I'll talk about that in part 2, but I just think that, having the club have a really light touch to the grass is very beneficial, because it makes sure that you're not over pressurized or under pressurized, that everything's just kind of ready and athletic. So now I want to talk about your center of gravity. So the center of gravity is really important in the golf swing. I'm going to say the buttons on your shirt are your center of gravity. So what I look for is the sternum and the belt buckle are the center of gravity. So the center of your head, the center of your sternum, and the center of your pelvis are your center of gravity. Now, as I'm going to draw some lines here. As I take the club away, and I'll do this for Mac too, just to give you a visual here. Let me clear that. Okay, so watch this. As Mac takes the club away, he moves slightly, maybe half an inch. Okay, so now watch this. So the club gets picked up out of the grass, so now we're raising. And then there's a tendency for you to kind of push the arms down and away and move off the ball. So you can see how, Mac, stayed pretty centered and pretty level, where you've moved sort of down and off the ball. We'll talk more about this in part 2, but ideally, now your center of gravity is your center of gravity moved. But ideally, we would just turn around our spine. So Mac's got his centers here, and he's gonna just kind of wind up, turning around his spine. So he's still centered at the top, and still level at the top. So we'll talk more about this in part 2, but I think if we can get you a little more centered throughout, because your head ends up being a big balance point in your golf swing. So to have it move this much, essentially where your eyes are looking, let's say if there's a ball here, So where your eyes are looking at setup, now we're looking from over here. So we're using more peripheral vision. So now the ball is effectively moving, even though it's not moving. Where if we stayed more centered, your balance would be better because, you know, he's kind of looking at it from the same place that he was looking at it from at setup. So, you know, that's just something that uh, as you know, refine your skills and as you refine your movements, you'll just look more and more centered and your head will be really, really steady. Because one of the big keys that Jack Nicklaus talked about was a steady head, because you're just kind of coiling around your spine. So the head and neck should stay essentially in a similar spot. It'll move around a little bit, but pretty close to us where it should be. Okay, so let me see here. Okay, so similar stuff here. I mentioned softening the right elbow because it looks to me like your elbows are aimed, your right arm's higher than your left arm, so it kind of aims your elbows to the left a little bit. So your arms are set up to cut across this ball right now. So if we soften this right arm, it should be a big benefit for you to sort of soften um, your path and get it more from the inside rather than across it, because you know a slice is happening when the club kind of cuts across it with an open face to the path. So we'd like that the elbows and forearms to be more just in alignment with everything else, because your thighs are in a good place, pelvis is in a good place, but the shoulders seem like they're over here in relation to your thighs. So you're a little crossed up in your lines. So I'll talk about this in part 2, but okay. And then you can see here how low the hands are. In a perfect world, I'd have, um, you know, the club, I'd want the club to run through about right here, my midpoint, and then I'd like to see a certain amount of distance between your thighs and hands. And I think by raising your hands slightly and pushing them more forward, you'll have some space in between your hands and thighs. Because we talked about, let me grab a video here. Sorry, one sec. So we talked about, you know, having a little bit more space in here and then having this run more through there, through the midpoint instead of below your belt. Um, okay, then you can see kind of the forearms more in alignment here. And this arm's, when I say softer, I just mean it's not as pressurized, so it's not as rigid. It's more bent, where yours is kind of just like rigid. And the fact that the right arm is really locked out makes the shoulders get pointed in this direction. Um, okay, so I'll talk more about this in part 2. But so long story short, a little bit higher hands, a little bit hands forward will give you a little more space there. Um, then I also want to talk about, um, to me, it seems like your center of gravity, like you're too bent over, because you're basically the underarms. Um, right here, the armpits, your armpits are sort of outside your toes, where Mac's are more kind of balanced over his feet. So I think in reality, if I drew the same line from Mac, so it's like just almost the ball of his foot, um, would be about right here. So I think you're just a little bit too bent over, um, because what I see happen is, now watch this. As you take the club back, the club's in really pretty places, but notice something here. Your head was pointing right there, okay? Now, as you took the club back, notice how much your head moved out over the ball. So what that causes is you to be too far onto your toes. Everything's leaning too this way. And when things are leaning this way, there's a lot more susceptible to slicing it off to right field. Because then from there you're going to have to sort of back out of it to deliver the club. So watch this. Your head had to move that same amount back to get to where it was at setup. So when you watch Mac here, it's just inefficient movement. So Mac, his head didn't move down toward the ball in the backswing, so he was able to push back, and flatten the shaft plane through impact because he'd moved about an inch back, where you start here, head moves down and forward, and remember the face-on video, it's moving down and toward to your right. So it's moving down to your right, and now we know it's moving forward. So I think if we can just get you, with how good your mechanics are, if we can get your setup a little bit different and get your balance a little different, going up to the top with a more steady head just kind of coiling around your spine, then you wouldn't have all this extra movement going on. Because, to go from a 90, low hundreds, high 90s to like high 80s, low 80s, we're just looking to get more and more efficient and knock off a lot of the unnecessary movement. So, you think of your visual perspective here. You're going from looking at the ball to moving off the ball to moving down toward the ball, now moving back away from the ball and up. So now that golf ball's moved all over the place in the time that it took you to swing the club. So if we can clean up some of the stuff at setup, and then I'll give you some drills to focus on just your center of gravity, you can make some serious quantum leaps in your ability, because you look like an athlete and you look like you're mobile enough to move really well. Okay, so that's about all I'd like to share for this session. So today we're going to focus on setup a little bit, your center of gravity, and then in part two, I'm going to give you some drills. I'm going to do a summary, but kind of point you in the right direction. So it'll give you some things to sort of work on. But I can absolutely tell that you've done the training and that you're really putting effort into this. So we can definitely get this really good. Um, okay, so that's all I've got for part one. In part two, I'll hop on camera and kind of summarize this in greater depth with some visuals, and we'll go from there. So thanks again, Andrew.